and welcome to Identity Crisis, a show from the Shalom Hartman Institute creating better conversations about the issues facing contemporary Jewish life. I'm Claire Sufrin, senior editor at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and editor of Sources, a journal of Jewish ideas. I'm stepping in for Yehuda Kurtzer for today's episode. We're recording on Monday, November 25th, 2024. Rabbi Benjamin Resnick's first novel, Next Stop, might be about the end of the world. I say might because it ends on a dimly hopeful note. Don't worry, I won't spoil the ending. The dystopian beginning and middle of the book give us plenty to talk about. The book's premise is that strange black holes have begun opening around the globe. They frighten and confuse everyone, but the holes have a strange power over Jews in particular. Some accidentally get close enough that they are sucked in, going down toward who knows where. One hole opens under Israel, sucking in the entire country. The strange holes give rise to an anti-Semitism with echoes of Nazism. Jews are socially ostracized, persecuted in ways that may or may not be government-sponsored, and they slowly crowd together into ghettos. We don't learn what happens after that because the main characters take the plunge and we follow them into the dark netherworld at the bottom of their local black hole. I don't typically read this kind of book. My husband loves dystopian novels, and the summaries he gives me when he finishes them are generally depressing enough that I choose to stay far away. But in this case, my interest in Jewish literature outweighed my fear of dystopian stories, and so I picked up Next Stop when it came out earlier this fall. In the interest of full disclosure, the author, Ben, is a friend, which added to my desire to give it a read. The book is not surprisingly permeated by a sense of despair. No one can explain what is happening, but more significantly, no one is offering meaningful guidance or suggesting a constructive way to push back or otherwise improve the situation. The situation of the Jewish community is a microcosm reflecting the situation of the larger society. Both are falling apart. Both need someone who can make sense of what's going on in a way that is compelling and then guide the group in responding. This being a Jewish dystopia, false messiahs abound, offering total escape, and some individuals are drawn to them. But what the people as a whole need is not a messiah so much as an organizer, a plan maker, and a gatherer with solid values and a vision that might resonate across the many differences within and beyond the Jewish community and then the society. We think and talk a lot about leaders and leadership at the Shalom Hartman Institute, and especially about thought leaders and thought leadership. Good ideas hold the power to enrich every aspect of Jewish life, and much of what we do is aimed at bringing those ideas to Jewish leaders out in the field, to rabbis and other clergy, to educators and other professional leaders, and to lay leaders. Perhaps that's why I found the lack of leadership in the novel so upsetting. In early November, I visited Detroit, where I joined two other Hartman faculty colleagues at a convening of 23 local rabbis. The overarching question we've been asked to address was, how do we make sense of this post-October 7 moment, particularly in light of earlier moments in Jewish history? This is a theme many of us have been returning to over the last year, expressing it in different ways. The rabbis in Detroit wanted to know, is North America different from the other places Jews have lived across time? Does the existence of the State of Israel change what it means to be a Jew in the world? We can't answer these questions just yet, and I don't think we'll have definitive answers in our lifetimes. But we can't shake the sense that we are living through an incredibly significant moment in the unfolding of the Jewish narrative, and this moment demands that we be flexible and creative in our thinking. And so my colleagues and I offered frameworks and vocabulary for thinking about these questions so that these rabbinic leaders could go back to what they do best, building, sustaining, and guiding the Jews who are looking to them for inspiration, education, and meaning, or, in other words, leadership. For the fall-winter issue of Sources, which is on its way to subscriber mailboxes and available online at sourcesjournal.org, I invited authors with expertise in leadership to reflect on the very nature of leadership. It's thought leadership on leadership, if you will. The idea for the issue predates October 7, but as you'll see when you read it, The Hamas attack on that day and the now multi-fronted war that has ensued have had a huge impact, not so much on the how and why of leadership, so much as on our need for good leadership. This is most pronounced in essays by two of my Israeli colleagues on the leadership crisis they are experiencing in Israel right now. While the remaining articles focus on the leadership needs of the North American Jewish community, they resonate with the themes my Israeli colleagues articulate: the need for a leader not only to have a quote-unquote vision, but specifically to have a vision for change and improvement. They echo the need for leaders who listen and the corresponding need for those leaders to be reflective and self-critical. Next Stop was published in September 2024, a little less than a month before the first anniversary of October 7, and I joked with Ben and other friends that he had anticipated the deep sense of despair that so many of us have been experiencing for the previous 12 months. But let's not let the joke distract us. There's despair and there's dystopia, and we have to be mindful of the difference. We, here in reality, are not on an inevitable downward spiral over which we have no control. At Hartman, we insist on hope, on defining a sense of direction, and then on moving. We insist not only on looking for leaders, but on finding them, training them, and inspiring them. The very best feedback I got that day in Detroit was from a rabbi who told me, "I'm feeling a little more hopeful. I have new ideas about what I need to be doing." My guest today is one of the first people I turned to when I began work on a sources issue focused on leadership, Rabbi Elka Abrahamson, president of the Wexner Foundation. In her piece, Elka uses a model called adaptive leadership to argue that the central task of leadership is guiding communities through change. She also writes that all leaders, even those who seem to be born leaders, must constantly be learning how to do their jobs better. Elka supports her argument with research and with stories from her own development and reflections on what she learned at key moments in her career. I hope you'll read Elka's piece and the rest of the issue. But for now, I want to open our conversation on Jewish leadership today by welcoming Rabbi Elka Abrahamson to Identity Crisis.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you're here. So in the piece that you wrote for Sources, you mention a brief stint as a camp counselor and some time as a pulpit rabbi. But for decades already, your name has been almost synonymous with the Wexner Foundation and its leadership training programs. So I'm curious to know what drew you to the Wexner Foundation and to leadership development as the focus of your rabbinate and your own leadership.
First of all, I have to get over the dystopian novel description.
I know.
Not a big fan, so I'm trying to refocus on just despair and then hope. I think that my journey has in some ways been a constant story of the revolving door, a little bit of an accidental leader, if you will. And that's why the piece started with that summer camp experience, because it was really someone almost literally dragging me by the collar to say, get up and do what you need to be doing. I think part of that is just not a common thing in Jewish spaces for me to see women up front. None of my rabbis, of course, were women. The only women I ever saw were social workers and teachers in my synagogues and schools. I would even argue that my journey into the Wexner Foundation was somewhat accidental. I don't know the real story, but my version of history is that without demeaning any of my own possible skills here, I think they were looking for women practitioners to teach fellows. And that my sense was that after every institute, a lot of women would say, we need people who look like us in front of us. We need women who are working full-time in Jewish leadership and have children. And I probably fit that bill nicely, having had 4 young children at the time. This was, 30 years ago. And was known to some of the people at the foundation. So I was invited to be on the faculty and found myself surprised by how little conversations about different kinds of leaders were discussed 35 years ago, and called the then president of the foundation for some advice. And he said, why don't you come and work for us? I was a very happy pulpit rabbi. I was job sharing with my husband in St. Paul. We joked that we had just thrown away the boxes, our moving boxes, said we're not ever going to move again. And then a month later, we were talking about moving. What drew me to the foundation was the pluralist nature of the space, because I think I'm in some ways a raised pluralist. I came from a home where my father, of blessed memory, belonged to 3 synagogues.
Wow.
Because he davened one every day. There was the one he left but felt like he needed to pay dues, and the Orthodox shul in case he needed as a backup. So I just sort of had this interesting view of the Jewish world, although I was raised pretty mainstream conservative. And then in the space of accidental leadership, I ended up working in a Reform synagogue because the educator met me in the parking lot. I was dropping off my cousins, and he said, "Who are you?" And he interviewed me in the parking lot and hired me to be on their winter camp retreat staff, which paid very well in college. And then ended up at Camp Swig in California. I mean, it was just a series of accidents that really led me into different Jewish spaces. So Wexner was sort of the right match for someone who fit everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And that said, and then I'll end with this, if you had told me when I came to the Wexner Foundation in 2000 that I would be its president, I guess 14 years later, I would have left. It was just the most unlikely job for me.
As you've been talking, it's been really hard not to interrupt you because you're reminding me of so many moments from my own life. I'll share just one because I think maybe it's interesting, which is I remember being, I don't know, maybe a second year student in college and getting a phone call from one of my peers saying, "Hey, I think you should run for Hillel president. What do you think about that idea?" And it, again, had never occurred to me. I'd been at the meeting where, the group of us, sort of the volunteer committee of people running Hillel, where we'd shown up and talked about the need for elections. And it took someone else saying, "Hey, did you ever think about this?" And I'm glad it was from a peer. I'm still grateful to him. And I should go back and find out if it was coming from an adult who had nudged him to nudge me. I don't know.
It does occur to me, though, that I'm thinking maybe for the first time how comfortable I was being in a number 2 or number 3 spot.
Mm-hmm.
The secretary of the student council, in USY, I was the co-chair of Kinus, but it would never have occurred to me to run for regional president. It just wasn't a possibility. I think that stayed with me for a long time. And then, and I don't know how many people listening to this will resonate, I had this story that maybe is true, that I could be more effective exercising leadership as the number 2 or the number 3 than I ever could as the number 1. That I would be more effective as the associate rabbi or as the vice president because I wouldn't have to be bothered with those big decisions and those big meetings that just kept you from what I would call the real work at the time.
I think that's really common. And even as you were speaking, I mean, Kinus, I was never a USY person, but I think it's a lot of work.
It's never too late, Claire. We can teach you a song and a cheer and you're in.
That's all it takes. That's fun. And then I feel like I'm, 16 years old again in my
then
body.
We'll get you a t-shirt. Then you're done.
Okay. All right. Perfect. But it's a lot of work, right? It's a big gathering. It's a lot of details.
Yes. And I actually remember feeling like at the keynotes, like, wait a minute, the guys, and the board was all guys, they're up front constantly. And we did all this work. It was sort of my first realization about what leadership was and how confusing it was between this, what we'd call charisma and upfrontness and kind of what we called, worker bees.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Totally. But yet you've ended up in a number 1 position. So I'm curious, for your own leadership at this top spot, have you brought with you the sense of worker bee? Have you changed what it means to be at the top?
I always feel like that's a question to ask people who work with me and for me.
Fair. What have you tried to do?
Right, but I know that's avoiding the question.
Yeah.
I remember, again, because I was called to apply for a pretty significant position in Jewish leadership outside of the foundation. And I was surprised that somebody would call me to be in that kind of a job. It was another shoulder tap saying, you might want to be the senior. And that's actually what opened my mind and heart to wanting to be the president at the foundation. And I was very lucky to have funders who were open to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
I knew a couple of things that had to happen. One was the team and my board chair people had to be comfortable with exactly who I was. And I had to be comfortable with who I was and not pushing myself to be some other vision of myself as a foundation president. And that I really wanted to never lose touch with what I'll call hallway management. You know, walking around the hallways and being in doorways and being welcome and not having the whole room be quiet because I just walked in. When we redid our offices early in my tenure as president, and I had an architect follow me for a day. I said, I want the building to reflect how we work. And he said, well, you work in doorways all day. I just hadn't thought of that,
Yeah.
You gave a list of what was needed in that dystopian moment. You gave a list of kinds of leaders.
You want me to go back to it? I said an organizer, a plan maker, and a gatherer with values and vision.
So I loved those three things and aspired to be all of those things. What I thought was missing was what I would call a heart opener. And I really feel like in this moment in Jewish communal life, that is essential. And that we're not going to fully arrive to a place of hope if we can't all say what we're really feeling and thinking in authentic conversation.
Can you say a little bit more about that idea of being a heart opener? I'm getting a sense of what happens once hearts are opened, right? That sort of authentic honesty that you're describing. But how does a leader do that for other people?
I think you have to bring your whole self to conversations. I think you really have to hear people, even if you're not going to change your mind, even if you're not going to change your policy or change directions. There really has to be a consideration of what's being said. I think a lot of people in Jewish leadership in big organizations arrive to their positions because they're really good at making decisions, because they have really good ideas. To then reflect in your own actions that you're open to other people's ideas is both hard, and I think it's actually a skill. And I've certainly had feedback in my own career that I wasn't open to ideas and have to check that all the time. We all know the description of you're not a good listener if you're only listening to respond.
Right.
That you're waiting for the person to finish. Checking that muscle when you're in a position of influence is hard, and it is so thoughtful to do it in a way that's real. Like, I'm really hearing you, even though, then you tick off 1,000 things. I know my ideas are better. I know I got this right. I mean, we're in this moment of like, really? Do any of us have it right? Like, haven't we been telling ourselves all kinds of stories the last decade where we didn't get it right? And how many people can we point to and say, you saw this coming and I didn't hear you? So I think the community is looking for both silver bullets, magic solutions. We'll stop anti-Semitism if we do these three things. Drawing really hard boundaries. And I admire and I appreciate that. I just don't think I'm made for that kind of decisiveness, even if sometimes I crave it, because I think it's what leaders are supposed to do.
I'm thinking about your image of standing in doorways, and the kind of listening that's harder is, we're always in a rush. There's no end to the work, but it's stopping, going in the doorway, sitting down, and pausing in that way, as though there's nowhere else to be. I think that's the kind of listening that you're talking about. And it's extremely hard.
It's also allowing your team to have informal authority every chance they have to have an encounter with you. I got into this work because I like community. I'm not a solo practitioner. I like being with people. I miss the office when we're not there 5 days a week, even though I know that's not going to happen anymore. I want work to be a place that's simmering with good conversations and good ideas and good humor and knowing each other. I think that's how organizations thrive. And not being apart from that, but a part of that.
Being part of the conversation.
Even the hard conversations.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's something that came up in the issue One of the pieces is like a curated conversation that I did with the professional and the lay heads of the Weinberg Foundation in Baltimore. And they talked about how it's important that the chair of the board know who's getting married and who's having a baby among the staff, and also who's having a hard time and needs a little bit more time or space or compassion. And it was really, for them, at the heart of their leadership vision.
Claire, you're also, because you're talking about Rachel, I want to add here that separate from the folks with whom you're working every day, the singular importance of having colleagues, and in my case, Rachel is one of them, who you can go to for really hard truths, to unpack the toughest situations without fear of being rebuked or criticized in a way that's inappropriate. We're all mistake makers. Like, failure is a part of how we grow. And to have that cadre of people who will say to you, wow, you are really off base on this one. And we're not careful in how we say it, but kind in how we say it. And having those colleagues is so important. And I think everyone knows that. I don't know if everyone cultivates those kind of conversations when you're at a senior leadership level where time is always an issue, where the busy trap is always an issue. I just don't have time for that. I think that's part of your job, is to find individuals who you can call and know you're going to have an efficient, honest conversation to check your work.
So that connects with another question that I was hoping to be able to ask you, which is, your piece talks a lot about change, but also about leaders as people who come in at moments when an organization needs change. And I'm curious, once a leader has, been selected, been in place, and really put into action their initial vision, what happens next, right? Is it just caretaking? How do you know when it's time for something else to change that you as the leader can do, or that it's time to leave and let somebody else come in? Like, what's the long-term goal of leadership or process of leadership beyond that initial vision?
My first response is that the new leader represents change in every possible way before you even talk about change. You come in, who you are is different. The way you speak is different. The way you connect to people is different. I think we forget that we are part of a huge change, especially in an organization that's used to a particular leader, whether it's, a different gender or an entirely different style of speaking or connecting. We have to be mindful of that. People have to get used to just who we are. Some of this goes back to what I was talking about earlier regarding our great ideas. We got to where we are because, man, we are idea people. My next job is going to be, you just come to me, I'm going to give you ideas, right? You can implement them, but I got the ideas. And you've been rewarded for that. And here you are. So here I am ready to give you all my great ideas, but the people with whom you are speaking are still attached to the way things are, no matter what, even if they were mediocre. Like, it's my mediocrity, right? Leave it alone.
Right. It's predictable. It's comfortable. It works well enough.
And I know it.
Right.
So I think we're talking the week of Thanksgiving, and we're all thinking about the next great sweet potato recipe. And, those of you who like to cook, you've got to learn how to cook basics first, right? You can't make a fancy sweet potato until you've made like one good one.
Right.
And I think leadership has a bit of that. You just have to know the basics of the place you're working. You have to understand the map of the organization. I think anyone who's come into a place new, even when it needs dramatic evolution, has been told, just listen for a bit. And yet the place wants to change now. So I think there's a bit of cooking going on in leadership. Where can I make changes and still have the table look like the one I know? And it's hard work, and it's relationship building, and it's heart opening, and it's asking people, what do you love about this place? What are the sacred cows in this place? I think there's a lot of learning that has to go on. And I do think most effective leaders understand that. I think you have to make room for a lot of voices in a change process, and that requires patience. Even if you know where it's going to end up. We've all been through changes that we could have done in the first hour we were in a position or in a committee, and it still takes 6 months because that's the absorbing of change people need and to feel like they had a voice in it.
So it's not just patience, but it's pacing also.
It's pacing. That would be the seasoning, right?
Right.
It's pacing. It's making sure that the right people have been consulted, asking around, who else should I talk to, indicating to people that this is not the decision of any one person. You're one voice of many. I think it's also, and I appreciate how hard this is, and that it's not something I encounter in my work very often, not giving individuals who have the most invested financially in an organization to have the largest voice behaviorally, that voices of influence come from all over the room. And that's something I don't think we're as good at as we should be. And going back to the heart opening, indicating to everyone in the room that we can be in community and disagree, which right now is incredibly challenging.
I think you're right. I think we can disagree and we can still make decisions as a group and act on them. I think that's part of being in a group. I want to circle back in a little bit to the point you made about resources and the connection between who gets to be a leader and who has resources. But first, I want to ask about the differences that you see between the skills that a leader needs in the Israeli community and the skills that leaders need in the North American Jewish community, because I know that you work with all kinds of North American Jewish leaders and also specifically with Israeli leaders of different types. And that could be, right at this very moment, a year after October 7th, or if you want to take a broader look, what you've seen consistently or seen change over the last 20 years.
People ask me what I love about working at the foundation, and one of the answers is the opportunity to come to know Israelis, not Israel. My relationship with Israel has changed so dramatically in this role. My belief in the state is different because of my belief in these incredible individuals. I don't think at our hearts we're different. I think there's a passion for justice and a passion for a gorgeous future for this democratic sovereign state of Israel. I think this last year has shocked the system of American Jews in a way that might be unique from how the system of Israelis experienced that shock. And we've had to navigate some of that. We've had to listen harder and, I think, speak less in our own Israel community with our Americans.
Can you explain just a little bit what you mean by that?
I just think we've had to hear their pain in a way that is really as compassionate listener and not respond. That's growing harder, I think, as the war rages on. And, every call we have with our Israel team begins with an honest assessment of how they're doing and what's their matzav ruach, what's their mood, what's the mood of the country, how are they reacting to fill in the blank, our election, our this resolution or that resolution. There's a lot, we sort of, I think we have a lot more room and patience for their responses. Sometimes less dialogue than listening, and I think that's all been fine. Our American leaders have wondered, what can we do? What can we do for them? How can we be present for them? Tremendous concern for their well-being. And our American leaders, particularly our professional leaders, really need support and guidance and instruction on how to hold their communities together, which is not necessarily in dialogue with our Israeli community. So there's been a lot to juggle, a lot of different needs, and they're all legitimate.
So it's almost two separate conversations, right? North American Jewish leaders helping one another locally. There's Israeli leaders helping one another locally. And what I hear you saying is when the two are in conversation, you find yourself giving more airtime to the Israeli leaders.
I think that's fair. I think there's a how are you that goes more one direction than the other direction. Although, there's our Israeli Westerners are quick to say, well, how are you? Things there are horrible.
Yeah.
I'm seated in Columbus, Ohio. There were Nazis on our streets 2 weeks ago. So yeah, how are we doing is a fair question.
How
And
are
I
you
think
doing? Elka, let's
there's
stop. How are you doing?
there's Nazis on our streets. It's crazy. It's crazy. There was 10 Nazis with black hoods on their faces and swastikas rolling downtown.
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying. What's interesting is, the hope that comes out of these ugly, ugly stories. I think there's a chance for new alliances to build here in Columbus, Ohio, or to renew alliances that were left dormant.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Nazis in Columbus were not shouting about Jews. They were shouting about other minorities, really vile things. And I think it was a little bit of a head turner, they're not just after us.
Right.
So I think city council and the governor and other city leaders have responded appropriately, and maybe some productive conversations and connections will emerge from it. That's sort of the hope. And some laws also about what you can do in public and what you can't do in public.
Right.
And all of that said, are you kidding? Are you kidding?
Right. How is this possible?
How is this possible? And how emboldened are they to walk through the streets of Columbus without their faces showing?
Right. And also, what do they represent? Right. Are they 10 people who, talk together in a basement somewhere? Or for each one who's walking, are there 100 more?
Well,
that's what scares me.
We used to think it was 10, right?
Yeah.
That was our belief. That's why I talked about a decade ago, the things that might have been said. I think there's more than 10 here in Central Ohio. I'm not, locking the doors and windows, but I'm aware of the moment we're in is far more treacherous than we might have believed. But I'm an optimist, right?
Yeah, right. We're all looking for hope. We're giving each other hope.
We're looking for hope.
You really do give me hope, in part just because of how level-headed and clear-sighted you are. But I want to pivot in just a little bit.
Just so you know, when this is done, I'll be screaming locked in the basement. Just so you know. No, I'm kidding. I will not be. I'm making sweet potatoes.
Right. There's not time to spend time screaming in the basement.
Right. You can only panic at 3 a.m.
Right, exactly. And then that's the time for sleeping, Elka, please.
Well, right. Sleep? Are leaders sleeping these days?
Sleep is very
Putting
important.
in a plug for self-care.
Yes,
For self-care.
Always. One of my kids was a little bit sick last week and slept most of the day one day and then got up and said, "Mom, you're right. Sleep really is the best medicine." And it was like such a parenting win.
That's so nice.
So sleep is the best medicine. So I'm going to pivot just a little bit, which is I want to tell you and all of our listeners a little bit of a secret, which is that when I first imagined this issue, which is, a year and a half ago, not long after I started as editor, it was about rabbis specifically. It was called What is a Rabbi? And in the wake of October 7th, as I saw all sorts of people emerging, sharing ideas, expressing themselves and all that, I realized the question is really much larger. The Jewish people need rabbis. There's no question. They're the, maybe our oldest model of what a leader is, but we need all kinds of leaders. And a few weeks ago, there were, 3 episodes called Rabbinic Identities, Rabbinic Crisis on this show that focused on rabbis and really showed us that rabbis themselves need support from a wider network of Jewish leaders of different kinds. So all of this is building to a question, which is, first of all, you're trained as a rabbi. I want to acknowledge that, but you also do work with all kinds of leaders. And I'm curious to know, well, 2 things. One is sort of the post-October 7th question, which we've talked about a little bit, but let's maybe since October 7th, how have you seen different kinds of leaders leaning on each other or working together? But the second question is really, what are the differences between spiritual leaders and other leaders? Like, what do spiritual leaders have that others don't? What do other leaders have that spiritual leaders don't? Whatever direction really you want to take it.
Well, I'm going to speak up for non-rabbis who are spiritual leaders.
Great.
My identity as a individual who exercised Jewish leadership was fully as a rabbi until I came to the foundation, where it might have been a bonus, but it wasn't seen as my core identity. And so much of my associations with other leaders, so much of that was with rabbis, and now it's, across the board. And I'm sometimes in a room with 25, 30 senior leaders, and I'm one of only a handful of rabbis. And one thing I push on in those rooms is not to make the rabbis give divrei Torah. That's ridiculous. You should all be doing Torah.
Uh-huh.
And everyone's uncomfortable, but then they do it. And I think spiritual leader, I would have to really think about how to even define that, which I'm curious if you could, since you used it. But I'll give you a minute to think about that. You're right. You're right. I think that anyone who exercises leadership in a Jewish community has the responsibility to add an element of Jewish thought and Jewish values and Jewish spirit, however defined. And I think we need to give space for that and training for that more deliberately. We expect our rabbis, I guess, to be able to do a good Dvar Torah, and also to probably hold a little space for silence or prayer or a meditative experience. And I don't think that should be unique to rabbis. Maybe we can teach others how to do it. I also don't want to diminish what a rabbi can bring to a leadership role. And it is that comfort, I would hope, with good text teaching. I would say a comfort with discomfort that I think comes with rabbinic training. Mm-hmm. I'm very comfortable with discomfort. I think it actually is productive discomfort, as I write about in the articles, really important for change. And I do think rabbis tend to have capacity to sit with that. And I would hope that we could expand that to more leaders. Look, I think we live in a moment where people need to cry, and we cry in meetings, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And we need to be okay with laughter, because we can't lose our sense of joy in this moment, and that's okay. Leaders are permission givers. I noticed in the election that this new phrase, permission structure, which is really just permission, but you add structure to it.
Yeah.
So I don't really know where that came from. But I do think there is a role to be played as spiritual permission givers to feel and to notice and to fall apart and then to build back together. And I think rabbis can do that using very intentional Torah, which I know is others in this volume have done beautifully, and I appreciate it. So I don't think we give enough credit to powerful leaders leading communal organizations, and certainly to educators who are just laser focused on how to be teaching right now and what to be teaching. And I just hear that everywhere. And it's not going to be a quick fix. How do we teach Israel? What do we teach about Zionism? What do we teach about difference? And those are big, long topics that I think we all need to be more focused on.
Mm-hmm. But also on creating space just for sitting with the difficulty of the questions, is what I hear you saying.
With each other, right.
With each other.
Like let our educators say, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to manage my fourth grade classroom when the parents are giving one message and the kids have another message and the expectations are through the roof. These used to be easier conversations. When I was an educator rabbi 100 years ago, when I first started my career, I was hired as the educator, right? Mm-hmm. And I sat through so many meetings where parents were frustrated that their kids couldn't speak Hebrew after 3 hours of classes for 2 years.
Right.
Like I long for that argument, right? Remember those days? We just thought about how to teach Hebrew. So, what are we teaching and when and how? And I think our educators need a lot of support. And by the way, we need a lot more educators to do that.
Yeah.
So if you're listening and you're not sure what your career ought to be, I recommend Jewish education.
And I would add to that, I believe really strongly educators are leaders just by virtue of, they can lead better or worse, but by virtue of standing in front of a classroom, that's a leadership role.
So much. And there's probably ways we can, I use this word, I know it's loaded, flatten our leadership structures in our organizations so that educators have a greater voice and have the opportunity to give divrei Torah. not only on bimas, but at meetings and in big Jewish gatherings, or a rabbi and an educator, or a rabbi and a Jewish community leader, or working together to give one message and sharing that. I just think we need more voices sharing spiritual messages with and beyond rabbis, as much as I admire our rabbis.
I hear you saying, our non-rabbis can learn from our rabbis how to respond to the moment that we're in. There are certain things rabbis are really good at that those of us who aren't rabbis could be a little better at doing. It reminds me, in the week immediately after October 7th last year, the whole Hartman staff had a meeting, and Yehuda laid out 3 priorities for what we should be doing in that week and sort of until further notice. And pastoral care was on the list. And I had this moment of pastoral care. I don't really know what that is, but it seems like it begins, as you were saying, by entering every conversation saying, well, how are you? Mm-hmm. What happened to you on October 7th? How did you hear the news? How is it affecting the people you love? How is it affecting you? I can handle that. I can have a conversation. I can, open a meeting. And I came to learn over the course of the week that pastoral care involved a lot of being very quiet. And that when people talk about, holding space, it means sitting on a Zoom call and allowing that one person is crying and another person may have said something that made the person who's crying cry, and there's not anything to say that makes it better.
Which sometimes is okay.
Which is okay. There's just the pain at this moment. There's just the pain.
You started that sentence by, I think, saying that Jewish communal professionals and educators have something to learn from rabbis. I think that's what you said.
Yeah.
We can roll back the tape and check. But I also want to say that I think senior leaders, be it rabbis or other senior leaders, have a lot to learn by speaking to that classroom teacher or that facilitator in a meeting to say, what are you going through that I don't understand? Mm-hmm. In that classroom with those confirmation students or those high school students? What are you hearing from them that I need to know in order to be more effective exercising leadership for the entire community? So I do think it's orchestrating a two-way conversation, and I don't think it diminishes your authority as the senior leader or as the rabbi, because we all have expertise that matters. Mm-hmm. And I do think expertise matters. I don't think anyone can become a rabbi by giving a Devar Torah.
Right.
Not everyone can become a great 10th grade teacher by teaching one session. So I think it's honoring each other's expertise and hearing what that is. Asking the team, what are you really good at? And letting them know where you're not particularly effective. So I just wanted to tweak that.
No, I appreciate it. And I also hear a return to the idea of standing in the doorways.
Yes, probably fair. Yeah.
Yeah, right here. Yeah. I'm here in your office to hear what you know, right? I'm not calling you into my office to tell you what I know, but I've come to hear from you. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about that I think maybe we've probably touched on enough, but I just want to get it out there is, so the issue is on leadership. And one of the things that I realized as I was working on it is that we don't actually have a lot of good synonyms for the word leader. I did a word find on the final PDF to see how many times the word leader appears. It's the issue is 152 pages long. It's multiple hundreds. I'm not going to give you the exact number because
not in my not just in my article.
No,
okay.
across the whole whole issue.
Yeah. I was doing the same thing. I was trying to find other ways to say it so I wouldn't repeat words. So I appreciate that.
No, it's really hard, and so across all of the articles, all 152 pages, let's just say the average by math is that the word leader appears multiple times on every page. And as an educator or as an editor, I don't know which hat, both hats, I'm always sensitive to things like that because I think sometimes when we are using a word over and over again, we are doing it because we don't really know what it means. It becomes sort of a euphemism or just a catch-all, and that allows other people to fill in what they think it means rather than really understanding what we mean. So, for example, there's situations where leader means somebody who's able to be a philanthropist and give a lot of money to support the cause, right? This is what you're talking about earlier, that in some situations, the biggest donor has the biggest voice and it's almost built into the structure. Sometimes we use the word leader to talk about potential. The Chicago Jewish Federation has a Young Leaders Division, for example, which is about cultivating lay leaders, but knowing that only a certain percentage of them are really going to move forward, let's say, into becoming more senior lay leaders. And sometimes it's just a title we give to make people feel good. And I think we've touched on all of these, but I want to push you, right, as you were looking for a synonym for leader, what were the kinds of words that came to mind?
One of the reasons I'm so drawn to adaptive leadership is this notion that leader is not, in fact, a title. Mm-hmm. That the kind of leadership we're talking about in the adaptive leadership framework is not limited to title. It is instead a unique activity, exercising leadership, with a defined set of behaviors that go with it. So I guess I don't really care about synonyms because it's less important to me than the activities and the behaviors exhibited by one who exercises leadership, which is very different than saying, I'm a leader.
Right.
I do think the word is used very loosely in Jewish spaces. I don't know if that matters. I don't know if it's a critique of the Jewish community. It's just a fact of the Jewish community. And I think those who are in positions of authority and influence need to think carefully about what they are doing in that position to drive change in their organizations. So I appreciate the question. I'm not avoiding it.
No, you're not. It's
even
a real
though I
answer.
did. Even though I did. I don't think it serves us well to find the right word for the noun itself. I think we really have to think of it as an activity and as something you do, not something you are, which I have found very helpful. And I've also found it to be very challenging and a little bit humbling. Like you don't get to be the leader because I called you that. And circling way back to where we started, I don't know if you have experienced this as well, but I was once at a meeting with foundation presidents. I was not yet a foundation president, but I was representing the foundation. And the president of another foundation approached me afterward, nice to meet you. And she said, boy, you're surprising. Yeah. And I did. Those of you who can't see Claire, she just made a face. She tilted her head and made a face.
Yes, face of puzzlement.
So I was also puzzled. And I didn't know if I should say thank you or something much worse, but I let it go and wrote her afterward. And I said, can you jump on the phone with me for a minute? Which I have no problem doing. I think it's really good to follow up on those kinds of conversations, not let them go. And I said, what did that mean? And she just said, you're disarming and wildly open. You know, I'll answer pretty much any question, probably at the time, wildly, inappropriately humorous from time to time, which I've had to cut back on. And I've learned that you can't disarm everything with humor and sort of leave it on the table and not guarded. And I think it was a disarming comment to me and helpful. You know, she didn't mean to be so dramatic in her feedback, but it's made me think about what I do, how I exercise leadership, and that people do notice and they are watching and they are looking to the leader for answers and ideas and validation and to be seen and to be heard. And that's a lot to carry. And I think I have always felt ever since that first, camp moment that I've really had to prove it, that I've earned it. And when I shifted from I've earned my place as leader to I can discover how to exercise leadership effectively through behaviors, it was a comfort to me. It was a relief. This is a doing, not something I am. And I found that to be a very helpful framing for how to behave in my role.
It makes sense to me. You're not living up to your title or seeking to be presidential or whatever that means, but you're leading.
Yeah, you have to be responsible to your funders and to your board, and that's all important. In my case, I'm trusted to exercise leadership for the organization. I'm not watched. When I've taught public speaking or when I work with rabbis on how to deliver sermons or how to write sermons, the first thing I say to them is, you have been given, 20 minutes? Depends, 12 to 28, depending on which shul, of time where it's your voice alone. Just think of the chutzpah that is. Think of the chutzpah it is for you to stand up in front of X number of people who are there on the holiest day of the year, when they're holidays, and take their time.
Yeah.
You better deliver something worth hearing and carefully worded. I think the same is true on a Shabbat in February in Minnesota, when there's 12
when
brave
only
souls.
The brave.
12 brave souls, the ones who will be the first when the Messiah comes. We're going to be first in line. Especially if we stay through Musaf, Claire, when it's 12 below. I think that's an attitude that I've brought to my leadership. It's not a burden. It's not, I better earn it every day, but this is a real kavod. Mm-hmm. This is a position of honor. And I have to tease out when I'm called to sit in this room or that room. Are they calling Elka Abrahamson, or are they calling the president of the Wexner Foundation? And I don't know who at one point early in my presidency said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Just go and give your best and make your time and their time worth it. So I think humility is really important.
But there's a freedom in that.
Yeah, it is freeing. Yeah. And it's humbling in a good way.
Yeah. Elka, this is at risk of becoming the longest episode of Identity Crisis ever. So I'm
that's what I was going for. I was going for the longest.
No, that's leadership.
Quality be damned, Claire. I want length.
So I'm going to ask you my official closing question. I want to go back to hope or inspiration and just ask you for one example of leadership that you've seen in the last year that has inspired you.
Yeah, there's a lot. I'm thinking of my Hillel colleagues especially, who have really been at the eye of a storm here. And of my Israeli colleagues there, I'm thinking of our alumni, Noam Tibon and Yair Golan, who ran into the battle on October 7th. Their story is just unbelievable. And I'm thinking of the Hillel director who has to absorb student after student who is either conflicted or in pain or afraid. Here at Ohio State, a couple of young women ran into the Hillel building and pulled flags, Israeli flags, out of a window and took them outside and stepped on them. And as it happened, the Hillel rabbi here was in the building and ran out after them and told them they were, that's our property and to return it, and got the license plate. And the end of the story is that this rabbi decided if these two young women would engage in dialogue with his students, there would be no charges pressed. It would just be about conversation. And it's such a small act in the grand scheme of this horrendous year on campus. But it's really beautiful that one rabbi took that time. And I know that his work is duplicated on campus after campus. And I'll end with just tremendous gratitude for everyone who is exercising leadership in Jewish community right now. I just know how hard you're working, how tiring it is, and what a difference you're making for people when they need it most.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And be courageous, friends.
Thanks for listening to our show. And special thanks to our guest host this week, Claire Sufrin, and our guest this week, Elka Abrahamson. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was produced with assistance from Annie Beyer-Chaffetz and edited by Gareth Hobbs at Silversound NYC, with music provided by SoCalled. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover in future episodes, so if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.